Welcome to Gutter Talk, the show all about comics and graphic novels. I'm your host, Matt Mitchell. Before we get into what I read throughout November, you might have noticed the Christmas covers hanging behind me, and I want to know what your favorite holiday-themed comic cover is, so let me know in the comments. Now let's kick things off with the new comics of the month. First up is the new series, Dark Knights of Steel. This is a mix of fantasy like Game of Thrones with Batman and Superman. Now the first issue is mostly character introductions and their modified origin story and establishing their relationships with one another. But I've really enjoyed Tom Taylor's past writing, and this Batman suit of armor is really cool, so I'm excited for the action that is surely to come. Next I read Hellboy, The Bones of Giants, #1, and oh boy, is this exactly what I wanted from a Hellboy comic. If you watched last month's episode, you'll know that the series that started in October was pretty lackluster and quite disappointing for me, but this series had all the action I was looking for. Hellboy and his team are out on an investigation in Sweden when an accident occurs that bonds the hammer Mjolnir to Hellboy's right hand of doom. Now you can only imagine all the action that ensues from there on, and I'm really excited for the issues to come. This is definitely a comic to read if you love Hellboy stories. Next is The Rush #1. Now this wasn't a series I was planning on reading, but I spotted it at my comic shop and thought I would give it a try. Basically, the story is set up in the Yukon during the gold rush, and miners suddenly start disappearing and being devoured by a mysterious creature. I really enjoyed the setting. It's kind of like the lawlessness of the Wild West, but up in the snowy mountains. However, I'm not quite hooked by the story yet. I'll probably read 1 or 2 more issues and see if it can really hook me and entice me to read further. This next issue I had to read digitally because physical comic shipments are delayed as British Columbia has experienced flooding and mudslides that have destroyed roads. And while that obviously sucks, there are people in much worse off condition than me, so if you're interested in supporting flood relief in British Columbia, I'll have some donation links in the description down below. In this second issue of DC vs. Vampires, Batman gathers the Bat family to test if he can trust them by meeting in the daylight, and then reveals a slew of weapons that they're going to have to use to potentially kill. Additionally, in the first issue, we caught a glimpse of Green Arrow, and it was mentioned that Oliver Queen hadn't been seen in some time. However, here we see that he seems to already know the situation and is fighting back against the vampires. This series continues to impress. If you haven't started reading already, I definitely recommend picking up the first 2 issues and catching up. This is more than some gimmick Halloween comic. It's actually quite a fun read. Definitely check it out. Last for the new issues of the month is Good Boy #1. Unfortunately, I didn't get to read this comic, again because flooding delaying shipments, but I wanted to really quickly mention it and we can discuss it more when the second issue is released. It has this really cool premise, a role reversal on the John Wick story where a dog hitman has his human die and he must go out on some kind of rampage, I assume. I'm really excited to see how it turns out, and we can talk about it more when that second issue is released. Despite all the delays with comics, I still had a lot to read when it came to graphic novels. So let's take a look. I wanted to read something in preparation for the release of Spider-Man No Way Home, so I decided on The Amazing Spider-Man One More Day. Now there's some clear parallels between this and the MCU, but it's definitely its own story. It's set closer to the events of Civil War, and despite images in this comic being the direct inspiration for what we saw in the trailer, it has different relationships between characters, particularly Spider-Man and Iron Man, who have a more tense relationship because Peter kind of betrayed Tony. Now, if you look this comic up online, you might see that it's one of the least popular Spider-Man comics of all time. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I can see how at the time they might have been pretty upset to discover that Peter and Mary Jane's marriage was ending. But it added a lot of stakes, and overall I thought this was a pretty good story and definitely got me in the mood for the movies. Moving from movies to TV series, this next graphic novel was to get hyped for the new Disney Plus series. It's Hawkeye, My Life as a Weapon. I really enjoyed most of this graphic novel. It was kind of a weird collection. The first 5 issues are great. Absolutely love them. It's Hawkeye and Kate Bishop also as Hawkeye, you know, buddy working together. And then for some reason they included Young Avengers Presents Hawkeye, where Kate Bishop doesn't seem to have the same relationship with Clint Barton. He's now Ronin and she's the only one to be Hawkeye, and they don't seem to know each other as well. Like, I don't think it was a bad comic. I think it just would have fit better with other issues of Young Avengers or something, and shouldn't have been included with those other 5 issues. That said, this is pretty much the definitive Hawkeye story you want to read, so if you're looking to get some background knowledge before watching the series, definitely check this one out. It's in quite high demand right now. The last graphic novels I read this month were recommended to me by a friend, and they are Once and Future. And I absolutely loved these books. They waste no time getting straight into the action, and it's this very interesting story that pulls from Arthurian legend and brings it into present day when our hero Duncan discovers that his grandmother is this retired monster fighter who now is bringing him into the family business. What I found really interesting about the first volume in particular was that they worked into the story that there's different opinions on the actual story of King Arthur. Different experts think different things happened, and that causes some confusion for the King Arthur character in this story because, as you'll learn, these are basically legends come to life. And in the second volume, we find out that it's not just King Arthur legends that can be brought into present day, it's any written legend. So we get to see Beowulf come in volume 2 and fight our heroes. This series is really funny and violent, and I really enjoyed it. It is definitely one of the best things I've read in the last few years, and highly recommend this. Moving on to the quote of the month, it should come as no surprise that it comes from Once and Future. Duncan has just been roped into the family business and is getting these tidbits of information from his gran, and when she says, 90% of driving in this business is smashing through gates at speed. And that's all for this episode of Gutter Talk. Let me know if I missed out on any good comics, and I'll try to pick them up before back issues run out. And if I don't see it in comic shops throughout December, have a Merry Christmas!